How Ukraine can win the war. The war in Ukraine has been ongoing for 12 years, including 5 years of full-scale invasion. In truth, it is difficult to estimate how much longer this war will last. But today, we can say with confidence that Russia's financial resources allow it to wage war for many years to come. However, Ukraine has an opportunity to achieve a decisive turning point in the course of this war. To understand how to defeat the enemy quickly and effectively, we must identify what drives the Russian economy, the very engine that funds its military. In other words, what generates the revenue Russia uses to finance the war? To answer this, let us look at the structure of Russian Federation exports. In 2024, Russian exports totaled $434 billion, of which nearly 60%, or $250 billion, passes through the ports of the Black Sea and Baltic Sea. For context, Russia's military budget stands at $167 billion, which is nearly 1/3 of its total export revenue. 60% of Russia's exports, $250 billion, flow through the Black and Baltic Seas. The main export categories are: first, oil and petroleum products at $125 billion. Second, metallurgy at $55 billion. Third, food and agricultural raw materials at $36 billion, with grain accounting for $10 billion. Fourth, mineral fertilizers at $26 billion. And other goods at $8 billion. Strikes on ports in the Black and Baltic Seas would block $250 billion in exports, and also cause $150 billion in import losses, inflicting direct losses on Russia in excess of $500 billion. This exceeds Russia's entire annual budget for 2025, $493 billion. Importantly, 75% of all Russian exports move by sea, with only 25% going overland. The Black and Baltic Seas account for 80% of Russia's entire oil and petroleum product exports, the very foundation of its economy. Given all of the above, Ukraine must strike Russian ports, not in a fragmented way, but in a massive, systematic, and methodical manner, combining port strikes with attacks on vessels. The objective is to destroy the ports of the Black and Baltic Seas and sink all vessels transporting cargo, thereby blocking 80% of Russia's maritime routes. Strikes should target any vessels, not only those carrying oil and metals, but also food, grain, fertilizers, and other goods.
What the Iran example shows. The example of Iran shows how it is possible to seize the enemy by the throat, even with a military capability hundreds of times smaller than their adversary, the United States. Iran needed only to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20 to 25% of the world's oil flows, to cause significant problems not only for the US, but for the entire world. Moreover, Iran did not even strike ports, it targeted only vessels. What is the advantage of striking ships rather than ports? Ports are equipped with air defense systems capable of repelling up to 90% of strikes, whereas ships are defenseless. Hence, strikes on vessels guarantee 100% success.
What the US example shows.
The example of the United States shows how to block a country's sea-based exports and imports, as demonstrated against Iran. The US blocked any vessels from leaving Iranian ports through the Strait of Hormuz. It was sufficient to damage just one cargo vessel, and then rely solely on warnings to turn back all ships departing from or heading to Iranian ports. Without firing a single military strike, the US blocked 100% of Iran's oil exports and 90% of all its exports and imports, resulting in losses of $500 million per day and the potential loss of $150 billion in annual trade turnover. These actions by the US are already set to trigger a major economic crisis in Iran. Instead of spending billions per day on war, the US, through military threat and economic pressure alone, placed the enemy in its most difficult position without any military strikes. This demonstrates that identifying an adversary's vulnerabilities and striking them precisely is thousands of times more effective and cost-efficient.
What Ukraine must do based on the Iran and US examples. In Ukraine's case, given that it is at war with Russia, strikes must be carried out against both ports and ships in order to completely block vessel movement in the Black and Baltic Seas. Once oil exports through the ports of the Black and Baltic Seas are halted, Russia will be forced to spend billions of dollars to shut down oil wells and mothball oil fields. This affects 5 of the 9 million barrels of oil Russia produces per day. A chain reaction will follow, where pipeline systems, pumping stations, logistics networks, oil refineries, and subcontractors servicing the oil sector will cease operations, effectively shutting down 60% of oil extraction and refining capacity. That is, more than half of the entire oil industry. Owners of oil fields, logistics companies, subcontractors, and refineries will be forced to lay off workers, as there will be nothing left to pay them once operations stop. At a minimum, several million people will lose their jobs. How Russia's financial sector will lose $1 trillion after port strikes and the blockade of the Black and Baltic Seas. The key point is this. If Russia loses 60% of its exports and 60% of its imports, then as a result, Russia will lose 60% of its foreign currency earnings. Simply put, the inflow of foreign currency into Russia will fall by 60%. Which will automatically trigger a devaluation of the ruble. The exchange rate will spike from 80 to 200 rubles per dollar, a 2.5 times increase. The Central Bank of Russia will need to inject tens and hundreds of billions of dollars to try to hold the dollar rate at 150 to 160 rubles per dollar, rapidly depleting its reserves. As of January 2026, those reserves stood at $826 billion, of which $300 billion is currently frozen by Western countries. As of March 2026, the total deposits of individuals in Russian banks amounted to 67.4 trillion rubles, plus an estimated 17.1 trillion rubles in cash held by the population, a combined total of 84.5 trillion rubles, or $1.1 trillion at an exchange rate of 76 rubles per dollar. Corporate deposits in Russian banks as of March 2026 amounted to 62.8 trillion rubles, or $826 billion. Combined, individual and corporate deposits total 147.3 trillion rubles, or $1.94 trillion, more than half of which Russians will lose due to ruble devaluation. Thus, Ukraine's massive and systematic strikes will result in the destruction of Baltic and Black Sea ports and a total blockade of all vessel traffic, leading to at least a twofold devaluation of the ruble and the loss of over $1 trillion by Russia's financial sector. To prevent major banks and key industrial enterprises from going bankrupt,
The Central Bank of Russia will be forced to spend at least $500 billion to rescue the financial and industrial sectors, effectively burning through all of its reserves. A large-scale banking crisis will erupt in Russia. Many banks will declare bankruptcy. The central bank will be forced to take external control over second-tier banks. Against a backdrop of widespread impoverishment, businesses will collapse alongside the banks. Companies will lose revenue and be forced to lay off workers. Millions will lose their jobs and stop paying taxes. Moreover, the newly unemployed will need to receive unemployment benefits. Large businesses will suffer severe revenue losses. Tax receipts into the Russian budget will fall sharply, pushing Russia toward insolvency. Public panic will set in. Russians will rush to withdraw money from their accounts and bank cards to buy dollars, household appliances, and food. Putin will issue a law prohibiting the withdrawal of funds from banks, as happened in Russia at the start of the war in 2022 with foreign currency deposits. Except this time, the restriction will also cover ruble deposits. Due to ruble devaluation, the real value of Russians' savings in banks will halve at minimum. Devaluation will drive up prices, compelling Russians to drain their savings. Not to save or grow wealth, but simply to cover daily expenses and purchase basic necessities. In short, Russians will be forced to survive. A mass, sudden impoverishment of Russia's population will occur.
What will happen to Russia's agricultural sector? Russia is the world's largest grain exporter. In 2024, Russia exported 71 million tons of grain, holding a 22% share of the global market. If grain exports are shut down, Russia's major grain-producing regions, Rostov Oblast, Krasnodar Krai, Stavropol Krai, Volgograd Oblast, and the Altai will be left without work or income. 71 million tons of grain will rot in storage facilities with nowhere to sell. Export companies will be unable to service the bank loans they took out to finance harvests. A wave of bankruptcies will sweep through the agricultural sector, again leading to mass layoffs and the stagnation of entire agricultural regions. Since Russia will also lose more than half of its imports, the cost of imported goods will double at least, leading to shortages and hyperinflation. And due to the general shortage of goods, prices will rise across the board, not just for imports. What will happen to the Russian economy after losing 60% of exports and 60% of imports? Russia's direct losses will exceed $500 billion, while the scale of indirect losses will be impossible to calculate. They will be at least 3 to 4 times greater. In other words, if Russia loses 60% of its exports and 60% of its imports, more than 60% of tax revenues will fail to reach the Russian budget. This will directly affect all public sector workers. Teachers, doctors, and other state employees will see their salaries cut by at least half. Pensioners will face cuts to their already meager pensions. All social benefits and scholarships will be halved as well. And that is the optimistic scenario. If today's Russian budget stands at $500 billion, it will shrink to under $200 billion. Russia will consequently be unable to fund its military at the same level of $167 billion per year. After Russia's budget collapses, financing a contract army will become impossible, meaning the Russian army will become incapable of continuing the war. The army will be left without weapons and food, as Russia will be unable to meet even the most basic social obligations to tens of millions of citizens, let alone fund the military. Production will halt. People will lose their jobs. Government wages will go unpaid. Offices,
banks, restaurants, and hair salons will shut down, triggering a total collapse across Russia and fueling protest sentiment in the regions and in Moscow itself. A chain reaction will unfold that will ultimately lead to the collapse of the Russian economy and, possibly, the fall of Putin's regime.
Why there is no need to strike oil refineries.
The destruction of Russia's oil and gas infrastructure is the key to victory. When it finally collapses, Russia will simply physically be unable to continue this war.
According to Ukrainian Presidential Office Chief Budanov, the goal of the armed forces of Ukraine is to disable 30% of Russian refineries, something he himself acknowledged would be extremely difficult. Russia produces approximately 530 million tons of oil per year, of which around 150 million tons go towards domestic consumption and 380 million tons are exported. In other words, the lion's share, nearly 70%, is for export. As a result, destruction of ports and elimination of all vessels, as well as the blockade of the Black and Baltic Seas, 50% of Russia's refineries will shut down on their own without a single military strike, because there will be nowhere to export the oil and petroleum products. Blocking oil exports will automatically cause 50% of refineries and 60% of the entire oil industry to cease operations. Why Moscow and other secondary targets should not be targeted. Moscow does not generate money on its own. On the contrary, it extracts revenue from the regions and is therefore not a source of income for Russia. Russia's primary income sources are oil and metals. If Russia is deprived of oil and metal exports, it is deprived of revenue. As soon as Russia loses its income, Moscow automatically loses its funding. Strikes on Moscow, refineries, oil pipelines, pumping stations, and other secondary targets burn through Ukraine's military resources, produce insufficient impact, and do not bring Ukraine closer to victory. These resources must instead be directed toward destroying vessels and blockading the Black and Baltic Seas. Similarly, there is no point in striking industrial enterprises that manufacture military products, drones, weapons, and their components. Once Russia is deprived of the bulk of its income, it will have no means to finance military production. The right approach is to cut off Russia's revenue so it has no money for these factories, rather than striking the factories themselves. Where the armed forces of Ukraine should strike. Russia's primary income sources are oil and metals exported through the ports of the Black and Baltic Seas, and it is these ports that must receive systematic and massive strikes. To this end, Ukraine's political leadership must declare a blockade of Russian ports in the Black and Baltic Seas, as Iran did with the Strait of Hormuz. Ukraine must publicly declare that any vessels entering the waters of Russian ports in the Black and Baltic Seas will be destroyed. Following this declaration, Ukraine must carry out systematic and massive strikes on ports and ships in the Black and Baltic Seas in order to block Russia's exports and imports, collapse its economy, and make it impossible to finance the Russian military, leading to Russia's defeat in the war. What Ukraine will do if Russia retaliates. It is clear that Russia will strike back against Ukraine's Black Sea ports. However, Ukraine holds a distinct advantage here. Ukraine's maritime exports amount to only $15 billion per year out of $41 billion total, meaning a significant portion of its exports already travel overland, and that smaller maritime share can be rerouted to land routes. Russia does not have this option, since 75% of its exports move by sea. Why Kazakhstan is more critical than it appears. Following the start of the war, Europe imposed additional sanctions on Russia. Yet the sanctions failed to produce the desired results. Why?
Because Russia easily exploits backdoors through allied nations, the foremost of which is Kazakhstan. Putin uses Kazakhstan precisely to circumvent sanctions, including to obtain military-related goods, which allows Russia to bypass them largely unscathed. Kazakhstan plays a key role in funneling Chinese imports into Russia, thereby keeping the Russian economy afloat. The shortest route for Chinese goods to reach Russia runs directly through Kazakhstan. After the destruction of ports and the blockade of the Black and Baltic Seas, Russia will once again have its back door via Kazakhstan. Even today, Russia uses the Kazakhstani Caspian Pipeline Consortium with a capacity of 83 million tons to reroute its oil exports. This back door must also be closed off by Ukraine to fully cut off Russian oil exports. To do this, strikes must be carried out on the Kazakhstani oil terminal, which consists of 3 single-point mooring through which Russian oil is loaded. Destroying the Kazakhstani terminal will require just 3 naval drones at a cost of $750,000 in total.
How much will it cost Ukraine to destroy the Russian economy and win the war?
A blockade of the Black and Baltic Seas must be declared to completely halt all vessel movement. For reference, Iran needed only to hit 2 to 3 vessels in the Strait of Hormuz to block the movement of 2,000 ships and seal the strait entirely. Ukraine will need to strike only 20 to 40 ships to completely blockade the Black and Baltic Seas. In the Black Sea, $70 million will be sufficient. $40 million on aerial drones, $5 to $10 million on sea drones, and $20 million on Flamingo-type missiles and underwater drones. A total of $70 million will be enough to destroy all ports and blockade the Black Sea. Destroying and blockading the Baltic Sea will be more expensive due to the distance and the need for aerial drones and Flamingo-type missiles at a cost of $100 million. $80 million on deep strike drones, 1,000 units at $80,000 each, with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers, and $20 million on Flamingo-type missiles, $600,000 each, with a range of up to 3,000 kilometers. This will be sufficient to destroy the oil ports of the Black and Baltic Seas and block all vessel movements to and from Russia. The ports must be completely destroyed and rendered useless for at least 1 year. Within that year, with no oil and petroleum exports, the Russian economy will collapse. In total, full blockade of vessel traffic and the total destruction of all Black and Baltic Sea ports will cost $170 million, the same amount Ukraine currently spends on the war in a single day.
Why air defense systems will not save Russia?
Even when massive strikes are carried out, even if air defense systems are able to repel 90% of them, the remaining 10% will still reach their targets, and that will be enough to destroy the ports, their docking facilities, and the laden tankers and vessels. With systematic strikes on tankers and vessels, the transportation of Russian cargo will come to a complete halt. Where strikes should be directed in the Black and Baltic Seas? Strikes must be directed at all Black Sea ports involved in oil and petroleum transshipment: Novorossiysk, the Kazakhstani CPC, Tuapse, and Taman. In the Baltic Sea, the ports of Ust-Luga, Primorsk, and Vysotsk. Additionally, targeted strikes must be conducted on vessels transporting metals, grain, and dry cargo in order to block the transportation and transshipment of all types of goods. The effectiveness of strikes on Black and Baltic Sea ports.
Ukraine will spend $170 million, while Russia will suffer direct losses exceeding $500 billion, with indirect losses in the financial and other sectors of the Russian economy amounting to more than $2 trillion. Ukraine's direct damage to Russia, $500 billion, exceeds Ukraine's investment by a factor of 3,000. This is an effective, affordable, and rapid plan for Ukraine's victory in the war. All that is required is a political decision by Ukraine's leadership. Declare a naval blockade of Russian ports in the Black and Baltic Seas, with a commitment that any vessels found in these waters will be destroyed by the armed forces of Ukraine. Destroy all Russian ports in the Black and Baltic Seas. Ukraine's fate lies in the political decision of its leadership. Glory to Ukraine.